The Lakers had just gotten beaten by the New York Knicks at Madison Square Garden. The final score was 112 to 100, a loss ugly enough that it should have been the only conversation. 12 points, a road beatdown, a team that looked completely out of sorts for 3 straight quarters. That should have been the story. But nobody was talking about the box score once the final buzzer went off. Nobody was talking about the turnovers or the missed defensive rotations or whatever the coaching staff was going to say to reporters waiting in the hallway. What they were talking about was what happened in the tunnel underneath that arena. Because Shaquille O'Neal was apparently standing there waiting, not as a broadcaster on assignment, not as a former teammate catching up with an old friend. He was standing there as a man who had decided something had gone too far and was not going to let it pass for one more day. And when LeBron James, coming off a bad loss, walked through that hallway and found the biggest presence in NBA history blocking his path with something to say, that moment became bigger than any game that was played that night. That moment became about history, about respect, about what the game used to be, and about a very specific comment LeBron had made that set the entire old guard on fire before the week was even over. To understand why Shaq was standing in that tunnel, you have to go back a few days and understand what started all of this. LeBron James was doing what he does, which is speaking at length with full confidence about the game of basketball. The subject turned to the modern era, how the game has changed, how the demands on the human body are different now than they used to be. LeBron made the argument that soft tissue injuries, specifically calf strains, have become more common because of how the modern game is played. More sprinting, more open floor, more lateral movement at the highest speed the sport has ever operated at. On paper, that is not a wild argument. Sports medicine professionals have said similar things. The game is genuinely faster in many ways. The floor is more spread out. The angles players are asked to cover defensively are different than they were in the 1980s and 1990s. If you want to have a calm and clinical conversation about how the sport has changed physically, LeBron's point has some real ground to stand on. But here is what LeBron forgot in that moment. He was not talking to doctors or sports scientists. He was talking to the internet. And the internet does not hear the careful version of what you said. It hears the headline. And the headline the old-school crowd took from those comments was simple and direct. If the modern game is harder on the body, that means the old game was easier. And if the old game was easier, then the men who played it were playing something softer. That is not exactly what LeBron said, but that is what the people who built this league with their bodies felt when they heard it. And that gap, the space between what was said and what was felt, is exactly where this entire thing exploded. Shaq heard those comments. You better believe he heard every single word. And Shaq has never once in his life been the kind of person who hears something that bothers him and then quietly decides to let it go. That is not how he is built. But here's the thing that people need to understand about the way Shaq reacted. His anger about this was not petty. It was not the desperate noise of a man who wants to stay relevant by picking fights with someone who is still playing. Shaq's reaction to those LeBron comments was philosophical. It came from a place deep in his belief system about what the game was and what it actually cost to survive in it. Shaq came up in an era where the rules of basketball were fundamentally different in ways that are easy to describe statistically, but are very hard to feel unless you were actually there. Hand-checking was legal in the era Shaq played through. You could put your forearm on a ball handler and physically steer him in a direction. You could apply body pressure in ways that would draw a foul call every single time in today's game. Flagrant fouls were called with a level of judgment that basically allowed physical intimidation to function as an accepted part of defensive strategy. Post-play was a war in the most literal sense. Every night down in the paint was an exchange of elbows and hips and bodies making contact at a level that today would result not just in fouls, but in suspensions and league fines and press conferences about player safety. But beyond the physical rules, there is the psychological piece, And this is where Shaq's argument truly lives. The pre-game rituals today involve curated outfits in the tunnel, handshake routines between opponents, social media moments, and genuine displays of mutual appreciation between players who grew up idolizing each other. None of that existed in an era where the entire emotional posture of competition was built around making the man across from you feel small before the ball even left center court. Michael Jordan did not hug opponents before tip-off. He studied them the way someone studies a problem they have already decided they are going to solve. He was deciding which part to dismantle first. Kobe Bryant would stare through his own teammates in practice with an intensity that made professional athletes nervous, and those were the guys on his side. Shaq himself was walking psychological warfare every single night. You were not trying to stop Shaq, you were trying to survive a night against Shaq. That is a fundamentally different challenge, and the difference between trying to stop someone and just trying to survive them is fear. Real, bone-level, can't-sleep the night before fear. That is what the old era ran on. And when LeBron suggests, even sideways, that the modern athlete faces a harder challenge than the players who came before him, what Shaq hears is not a medical argument. What Shaq hears is someone claiming that the present produced something the past could not, and that is where the fuse meets the flame. Now let us talk about what actually happened in that tunnel at Madison Square Garden. Reporters who were on site and moving through the corridors after the final buzzer described what they saw as a deliberate confrontation, not two people accidentally crossing paths in a busy hallway, not a chance encounter that turned tense. Deliberate, the way you are deliberate when you have already decided what you are going to say, and you are simply waiting for the other person to walk into the space where you are standing. Shaq was reportedly there waiting, completely still, the way someone waits who has already had the conversation in their head and is just waiting for the physical version to catch up. LeBron came off the floor after a bad loss, walked through that corridor, and found the biggest human being in the history of the NBA blocking his path with something on his chest. Think about what that image actually means. We live in a time where almost every conflict between players and legends gets processed through social media, through tweets and hot take segments where everyone is seated comfortably with a producer nearby, making sure the conversation does not go somewhere dangerous. There are guardrails everywhere in modern sports media. There is always a camera with a red light indicating that someone, somewhere is watching, and that there will be consequences for going too far. There was none of that in the tunnel. No producers, no publicists, no carefully worded statements prepared in advance, just two people and a conversation that had been building not just for days, but for years. Because the friction between Shaq and LeBron on the subject of what basketball greatness actually means is not something that started with one podcast clip. It has been a slow build happening in the background of NBA culture for a long time. Every time the GOAT debate comes up, every time someone positions LeBron's era as the ultimate peak of what this sport has ever been, every time a writer casually dismisses the physical demands of the 1990s as primitive compared to the current product, Shaq has absorbed all of it, and he has never fully been at peace with the way those conversations position his generation as the rough draft, the unpolished early version of the sport that the current era then came along and perfected. The tunnel was not just about one comment on a podcast. The tunnel was the place where years of accumulated frustration finally found an address. And right at the center of all of this is Michael Jordan, because Jordan is the reason this entire conversation carries the weight it does. When LeBron's comments touched on the evolution of the game, he was not just making a point about injuries, he was brushing against the question that is more explosive in NBA history than any other. The question of whether the league Jordan played in was actually as demanding as people remember it being. That question is gasoline, and Shaq does not treat it as a debatable topic. He treats it as settled history that keeps getting quietly challenged by people who were not there to experience it.
Shaq has said clearly and without hesitation that when he looks at LeBron, he does not see what Michael Jordan was as a player. He does not see what Kobe Bryant was either. He has said directly that LeBron does not have that gene.
The specific thing he is talking about is the ability to take over a game, to want the last shot not just because it is the right basketball play, but because there is something in you that needs to be the one who decides how the night ends. The ability to demoralize an opponent, the ability to make people scared of what you're about to do before you even do it. Jordan had that. It was not just a basketball quality, it was something deeper. It made opponents go home after games and lie awake replaying what just happened to them. It haunted people. That is not something you measure in a box score, but it is real, and every player from that era will tell you it is real in plain language when you sit down and ask them honestly. There is one number that keeps coming up in this conversation, and it is worth stopping on for a moment. 6-0. That is Michael Jordan's record in the NBA Finals. He went to the Finals 6 times and won all 6. He won the Finals MVP award in all 6 of those series, every single one. When you bring up that number in the GOAT conversation, people who want to push back will tell you it is not fair to judge players purely by championships because winning a title depends on the entire team. And that is a reasonable point in most cases, but Jordan's 6 finals appearances and 6 championships came across different rosters, different supporting casts, different opponents, and different eras of the league. The one constant in every single one of those runs was Jordan, and his number compared to LeBron's finals record is a comparison that speaks for itself without needing anyone to explain it further. Now let us talk about what the cultural stakes of a moment like this tunnel confrontation actually are, because they go far beyond the basketball court and far beyond any debate about rings or statistics. What Shaq did in that tunnel is a very specific kind of act. It is a legend defending a standard. And when legends defend standards in basketball, it resonates with people who never played a single minute of organized ball in their entire lives. This kind of conversation lands in barbershops across Atlanta, Chicago, Compton, and Brooklyn. It lands in conversations between fathers and sons who grew up watching Jordan play and are now watching LeBron play and have very strong feelings about what greatness actually is and whether the new version of greatness shows the proper respect to the version that came before it. This is generational in the truest sense of that word, not just basketball history. It is about how different generations understand toughness and what you owe to the people who built the thing you are now standing on top of. Shaq's presence in that tunnel carries weight because he is not just a former player with opinions, he is a monument. He is living proof that an era of genuinely brutal physical competition produced men who are still standing, still vocal, and still deeply uninterested in being politely moved to the background while someone else quietly rewrites the story of what this sport used to be. And here's the part that doesn't get examined closely enough in all of the noise around this story. The real damage to LeBron from a moment like this does not come from headlines or press conferences. The lasting damage, the kind that sticks around and shapes how people talk about a player long after the cameras have moved on, comes from what people say privately, what players say to each other in locker rooms when nobody is recording, what coaches say when they are being honest in small rooms with people they trust, what the old generation of players says when they are talking to younger players about what real competition looks like and what it demands from you. Those conversations happen without any cameras present. They happen in gyms and in quiet settings among people who played the game at a level that gives them the right to have and share an opinion. And in those spaces, a moment like the tunnel does not get fact-checked or given context by a public relations team. It just becomes part of the story that gets told about you. LeBron's legacy has always had one persistent question mark attached to it. Not the championship debate, not the statistics. The question is about fear. Whether LeBron, for everything he has done across more than 20 years and 4 different franchises, made opponents actually scared of him.
Scared in that specific way where players would go on record years later and say that the night before facing him, they could not sleep because they already knew what was coming. LeBron has had transcendent moments, the block in Game 7, the 2016.
LeBron's supporters will say that measuring greatness by fear is unfair and that the game has changed, that in an era where players are also business partners and brand collaborators and members of a shared culture of mutual respect among elite athletes, the way competition operates looks different by design. That is a fair observation. The game has genuinely changed in terms of how players relate to each other on and off the court.